Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of our Community Action Network series of co-governance webinars. We host these sessions monthly on the last Wednesday of every month, and these webinars are a space for local community organizations and others to learn how to expand some of the work they're doing in their communities and learn from other groups who are blazing the trail of what we call co-governance and local accountability. I'm Julia Fish. I'm the manager of JoboCan, which is an initiative of Outer. If you have any questions for tonight's panel, please make use of the chat at the bottom or the Q&A functions, and we'll get to as many of them as possible in the last 15 minutes or so. So we've got a contentious topic tonight. Tonight we are talking about public land occupations. This is a very divisive issue in communities and a strong topic of debate on community forums and WhatsApp groups throughout the city, and I assure you, even in the offices and Outer. So we don't claim to have all the answers. These sessions are not a one-size-fits-all, this is going to solve your problems kind of space. We do, however, encourage a legal and pragmatic approach to issues facing community organizations, and we offer both experts and examples in these spaces to help communities work together on shared topics and problems. So tonight we are seeing what communities can legally do about occupations in greenbelts and on public land while still maintaining and respecting the desperate plight and dignity of occupiers. So to answer some of these questions, well, debate some of these things, we're joined by three esteemed panelists. We have Kelly Kropman, who's the director of Kropman Attorneys. Kelly is an attorney specializing in public interest law and human rights. Kelly holds a Bachelor of Education from the University of Johannesburg, an LLB at the University of the Witwatersrand, and an LLM in human rights law from the University of London. Kelly runs a private practice right here in Johannesburg, specializing in public and administrative law with a strong focus on socio-economic rights. A notable matter that Kelly litigated was that of Tamadi and others versus the city of Johannesburg and others, which vindicated the unlawful eviction of people living on the Alberts Farm Conservancy. We're also joined by Reshma Somaru. Reshma is the secretary of the Southeast Midrand Suburban Alliance, formerly known as the President Parks Residents Association. The SMSA will tell us about some of the tools they and neighboring RAs are using to push the city to act on occupations in their area. And we have Judith Anser, who is joining us from the Greenside Residents Association. She is their chair and member of the Save Our Spruit Alliance. Judith will tell us about the engagements and actions Save Our Spruit has had with the city and private entities of the occupation of a JPC-owned property in the Parkhurst Bowling Club. I always get confused, Parkhurst Bowling Club or Tennis Club? I think it's the Bowling Club. So I mentioned, let's get really stuck into this. Kelly, you represented the occupiers in a case against the city for their unlawful eviction from the Alberts Farm Conservancy. And you're obviously a specialist in this area. Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me. I know that the Alberts Farm matter had raised a lot of eyebrows from a lot of perspectives. And I'd like to give a little bit of background about it, just to help people understand what is being done on a regular, semi-regular basis by the city of Johannesburg. The people who live in and on Alberts Farm Conservancy do so because they don't have anywhere else to go. It's not the most pleasant place to live, although it's not the most dire place to live either. In 2022, the year before I had come on, in 2022, the JMPD and the city parks had come in and, without a court order, demolished all of the homes of the people living on Alberts Farm Conservancy, erected a fence around it, which was locked at night, and threw away all of their possessions. This was then followed by another law firm called Power & Associates, who brought an urgent interdict to restore everyone to the park and to give them access to the park at night, all of the occupiers. This was followed by a court order which stated that the city may only evict the occupiers of the Alberts Farm Conservancy with a valid court order in terms of the legislation, being PI, the Prevention of Unlawful Evictions Act. And that was all good and well, and the city did nothing in terms of the court processes that they had been mandated and just are mandated to adhere to. Almost a year to the day. So on the 8th of August, the following year, being last year, sorry, this was 2022. I'm getting my years mixed up because time is a fiction. What had happened was the JMPD, the South African Police Service, and private security had pitched up and done exactly the same thing that they had done a year prior. Again, without a court order and with the interdict from the previous matter still in place. So we then went with some urgency, some extreme urgency, to demand of the city that they reinstate everyone and return their possessions. I mean, we had people who had lost their medication for their cancer treatments. People had lost the Bible that one of my clients had lost the Bible his father had given him. People had lost cooking and cleaning materials, clothing, all their worldly possessions. The city of Johannesburg immediately, responded the next day by proffering tents, sleeping bags, and an attempt to restore some of the possessions. The tents and sleeping bags were welcomed, obviously. The possessions which were returned were building materials which had been destroyed, and all of the personal effects which had been taken were not returned to our clients. We then needed to try and conceptualize a way in which this wouldn't happen again to these people. And what we had asked for the courts to consider is to provide punitive constitutional damages for each of the residents who had been displaced without a court order, who had been evicted without a court order and had their possessions taken. And the city then agreed consented to an order which provided that they would give each of the occupiers 1,800 Rand in lieu of their lost possessions as a form of constitutional damages, as well as the tent and sleeping bag. The previous court order still stands, which says that the city may only evict people from Alberts Farm Conservancy if they follow the law. And what the city's obligation in this regard is to provide emergency alternative accommodation to those who would be placed in a situation of homelessness if evicted. Now, it's very clear that the people living on Alberts Farm Conservancy who are unhoused would face homelessness if pushed out of the park. So the city of Joburg has itself in a difficult position. If they are to evict, they must find alternative emergency accommodation. Now, this is not a mansion in Michelangelo Hotel. This is a form of housing much more akin to hostels. But it's something that is weathertight, and it is a safe environment not to be on the street. The city of Johannesburg has perpetually stated that they do not have enough housing stock to provide emergency alternative accommodation to all of those who need it. This got log-jammed many years ago through a matter called Ladler, where the city said, if we can't onboard people to become more employable, then what do we do with them? And the sad reality in that case is that the city hasn't done anything to provide different types of accommodation for different people. They also aren't taking advantage of mechanisms that they could to take possession of buildings that have been long abandoned in order to provide this accommodation. And there is some forms of maladministration in this that lead to a degrading of whatever properties are available for emergency alternative accommodation. This is the floor, not the ceiling. This is the sub-minimum that we should be providing for people. But I think that one of the very important takeaways for everybody in terms of the Alberts Farm case is that the city acted in a way that was wholly unlawful, that they had no ability to act in. And they did so thinking that they wouldn't get any opposition because these people are poor. And although I don't want to rely on extreme arguments here, but It is a very slippery slope when the most vulnerable can be victimized by the city, for those same city officials to then take more and more grandiose steps to eroding the rule of law as it applies to the rest of us. And the protections that we have would be eroded too if we're happy and complacent, and in fact, to an extent, complicit in the erosion of the rule of law for our own personal conveniences. And this is not to say that occupation of public spaces is lawful, and it's not to say that people should be living in parks, but it is to suggest that when people are in such a dire position as to resort to living in a park, that we should hold our public officials to account to adhere to the rule of law in order to give effect to it, and that everybody's human rights are respected. And one of the big main points on this is our Constitution states that nobody may be evicted arbitrarily or have their homes demolished arbitrarily, and nobody may be evicted to homelessness. Now, if we're happy for the most vulnerable, this to happen to the most vulnerable, I really do believe that we are giving the ticket to the powers that be to act with impunity going forward. I deal with many eviction cases, one of which the city is refusing to provide people with emergency alternative accommodation on the basis that the city doesn't have any stock, while saying that the occupiers who are facing eviction should go and ask the Johannesburg Social Housing Company for alternative accommodation. Now, if the city doesn't have stock, then going and applying for housing doesn't make any sense. And this non sequitur thinking where departments don't understand what other departments are doing, and it results in an affidavit that makes no sense from the city, there are many of them, is very problematic. And whether people are acting with impunity or whether people are acting as a result of incompetence, the result is going to blow back on everybody eventually.
So you
that would be my
specifically
interpretation.
mentioned that there's mechanisms that the city is not using. Well, not just the city, nationally, that governments are not using. What are some of those mechanisms that could be and should be being used by government to be able to create stock within the temporary accommodations realm, or even just housing in general?
Well, yes. So if we look, thank you. If we look at the housing code, the National Housing Code, which is created by the National Housing Act, is a roadmap for provincial and local authorities to start developing housing availability to people who need it. And that starts with emergency alternative accommodation, but that goes into subsidized and low-cost housing generally as well. The National Housing Code is not being adhered to. So the city needs to do an audit of the land and buildings it has available. They don't. They don't make provision to develop and access funds that are available to them. So provincial has funds available to local municipalities to provide emergency accommodation if necessary. These funds are often overestimated. And what I mean is that municipalities ask for too much, underspend, the money gets taken back, and then the budget gets readjusted for the following year. So when money is actually needed for such an event, say a dramatic fire in the inner city, then there is nowhere to purchase or temporarily use. In cases of natural disasters or other types of emergencies, the city is also enabled to temporarily seize land for this purpose. This happened across from Leeuwkop's prison some years, a decade or so ago, to house people who were victims of a flood. Cities can also go and claim back through court processes the properties that have been abandoned where rates and taxes exceed the value of the property. These are all mechanisms that would be available to a functioning metropolitan city or even a smaller municipality. But we're not mechanizing these things. And this is not a Joburg specific issue. But it is a Joburg issue if we're concentrating in Johannesburg, not doing what it is meant to do. And perhaps on a political point, it's because we have such a quick turnover of political leaders and principles within the city, that there can't be structured policies that have any, sort of longevity.
Have you seen any kind of community or local groups that have been able to hold the city, or mechanisms that are available for people to hold the city or government accountable for not using those mechanisms?
So there are ways and means. Unfortunately, I look at all of this through my lawyer's lens. So I have maybe a slightly myopic view of it. Through civil society organizations, holding the city to account requires quite a bit of resources in terms of understanding, A, what the bylaws say and what those mechanisms are, and then people having the time to engage, to do the PIA requests, to analyze the decisions, to sift through the data. I have not come across organizations that have been able to do that in Gauteng specifically. What I do see is on case-by-case basis, looking at people who are facing eviction and trying to find alternatives to either facing the eviction, i.e., having the city purchase the property and create socialized housing. That has happened on a case-by-case basis, but it is rare. And the other alternatives that you see are through protest, and I'm not suggesting violent protest, but through civil disobedience action, having the city find alternative ways of mediating issues. So if there's a rental boycott, for example, and the rental boycott is as a result of electricity being cut off in a property, and this is not necessarily public spaces, then the city has at times mediated those issues with the owners, and through creating acknowledgement of debt mechanisms, been able to get the lights back on so that the owner can pay for the electricity that they hadn't been paying for in the beginning. When it comes to the occupation of public spaces, I think that there are our greenbelts and our parks and our spaces that we all engage with and want to be safe and clean and able to be utilized, but it's much broader than that, because the city has a lot of land that they're not even aware of. Patches of earth that could be utilized for social housing, could be utilized for RDP housing, could be utilized for emergency housing, which are just not. The other way of looking at the housing crisis is why the Gauteng and local governments have cut funding from NGOs who are providing emergency services very rapidly and in a way that's only going to cause a further crisis. So if the plan is for the city of Johannesburg to assist its own occupiers and residents, shooting itself in the foot by killing the service providers does seem to me to be quite counterintuitive. And that erodes the ability of civil society to hold the state to account.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's that kind of co-governance thing that we're really passionate about as Joburg Can, is like, how do we work with governments to be able to ensure that these services and things are done in a dignified and full way, and that the budgets are being used properly to be able to do this kind of thing. I'd like to thank everyone for their comments in the chat and the Q&A section. Please keep them coming, and we'll get to those, as many of them as possible, in the last 15 minutes or so. I'd like now to turn to Reshma. You are with a community in Midrand. Tell us a little bit more about your location and makeup, and what your suburb and home looks like.
Yeah, sure. So I stay in President Park in Midrand. It's an agricultural holding type community. And we sit adjacent to Rabi Ridge on the one side, and on the other side, halfway house where Gallagher Estate is, Midrand CBD, and then Waterfall at the bottom end of the neighborhood. There are a couple of suburbs that are agricultural holdings sitting in the middle. And with the development that's been happening recently over the last 10 years or so in the space, I think a lot of people have caught on to the fact that there are these large pieces of land. The average size of a property is 8,500 squares here. And there are quite a few unfenced, undeveloped, vulnerable lands that are being targeted. Yeah. So I think for me, though, it's personal. I grew up in a township called Lenasia South. It's south of Soweto. In around 2017, there was a land invasion on state-owned land, coupled with corruption, and it's now become an accepted township all these years later. The result of that unplanned township was permanent infrastructure breakdowns, permanent water and electricity load reduction, waste and affluent kind of overflows in the area, a bankrupt municipality a decade later with a budget that has never recovered. And there's constant frustration, violent service delivery protests from the new residents in the community, frustration and sellout from the established residents in the community with these lovely white elephant homes and properties that are now worth a fraction of their value, like 25% of what it was worth a decade ago. And there's no basic facilities. And we've got this community that's at odds with each other, with both sides feeling abandoned and let down by the politicians. Crime is rampant, and really no one has won. And when I moved to President Park, my husband and I bought this plot with our elderly parents who weren't able to sell their house, and who were kind of blue collar business owners, didn't have any pension fund. So they live with us here. And in 2021, we found that this kind of problem, this plague, has followed us into this area. In 2021, we became aware through the community that there was a campaign, an organized campaign to target these very attractive 8,500 square foot properties in the area. There were a few bodies that were apparently campaigning and getting people together to invade these properties. The community wanted to do something about it. At the time, I didn't know what I was getting myself into, but we believe together, the strength of all of us together is worth more than the sum of each one apart. So we volunteered, we started small, and a group of us revived the old residents association. We identified all the vulnerable properties using Google Earth, driving around, using GIS. We then tried to activate the landowners of these properties, depending on who GIS told us own them, trying to inform them of the threat of organized land invasion, trying to encourage them to fence and protect their properties, motivate them with fear. We tried a community fencing project where we got community volunteers out. We put up these 3 string fences, posted a lot of, no trespassing signposts. They got cut a couple of weeks later, but we started small and it seemed to work in President Park because we evaded the land invaders. But we did notice with concern that a JPC-owned property in the neighboring community of Austin View, bordering Robbie Ridge, was invaded, and that when the city went to court to evict them, the city lost that case. So from there, that kind of started us in this community in President Park, monitoring what was happening. Then last year, we saw a new property in Austin View, about 2 kilometers away from my home. It got invaded, and there were 3 or 4 properties together that were vulnerable in that space. And I think this time around, as we noted with concern that this invasion was growing, I started seeing the signs again that we saw back in Lenasia South. So petty crime in the area increased, waste, air pollution, cable theft, illegal water and electricity connections tapping into the neighboring properties. I approached the community in Austin View to try to help give them some guidance on how they could potentially organize. I somehow got roped into creating a petition for them. We got 1,000 signatures on that petition, attention from a few MMCs, and then nothing. And then I think the community in President Park decided this was too close to home for comfort. And we decided that we were going to combine forces with the neighboring agricultural holding neighborhoods, being Glen Austin Extension 3, Austin View. And we then created the Southeast Midrand Suburban Alliance, and that was to deal with our common threats. I guess the most pressing issue being the land invasion that drove coming together, but also with these agricultural holding type properties, we have similar types of issues with service delivery. And then, you know, once that had happened, I started focusing on this land invasion in Austin View, like completely. Last year, the land invaders started targeting a new property in Austin View, next door to the one that they invaded. So on the 10th of October, there was a private property across the road that was invaded. This was now a known property because in June last year, the property owner had actually shared information via a town planner about a proposed development, low-cost housing, mixed-use development. It was something that was exciting for us. In November, the property owner then went to court, won his case to evict. The day he evicted, land invaders, they were removed, they came back the next day. What we noticed as a community, just, you know, observing from the side, is that they were really well organized. When you drive past, you see expensive SUVs conducting meetings on sites. You see trucks that come through with new building material. You notice that the building material is generally cardboard type structures. That kind of suggests to you that, well, they don't want to invest too much right now because they expect those structures to be torn down. And then, of course, as soon as the stuff's moved by the red ants of the JMPD, you see those trucks coming back with more structures or with more boards for them to build again. So through our petition, we got a couple of signatures, we got attention from a few MMCs, and then nothing. And then, you know, we said, okay, fine, let's try to approach this strategically, because we can see that it is being approached strategically by the land invaders. So the land invaders are saying that they are members of the community of Robbie Ridge. We try to engage with Robbie Ridge because they are part of the same ward as ours. And what we've understood is that there are people in Robbie Ridge that have been waiting on a backlog for the Department of, I think, Development Planning and Human Settlements to provide housing, and that hasn't happened. But these are not the bulk of the people that are doing the invasion. They don't know where some of these people are coming from. So now we've got this three-pronged strategy on how we're going to be dealing with it. So strategy number one is we've communicated to all the stakeholders that as a community, we want to support responsible and well thought out development in the community. We have decided that we will coordinate and organize our community members. So if you think about bees, we've got this kind of tactical solution. So immediately when we notice an activity on site, we encourage community members to call through to the JMPD hotline and report. It's almost like a bee sting. It's annoying. You don't get anything done. But it annoys them. Sometimes that hotline doesn't work, but we evidence all these calls. Once they've reported it, they then share that information in a group, and we start evidencing it, and we try to get as much information and referencing around it. We've then identified other stakeholders, the ward councillor, who went from, well, it's not my problem, to actually pulling in MMCs, and I think it might be one of her campaign promises now to deal with the land invasion. We've identified the Region A JMPD superintendents responsible for land invasion in this area. And so we've got them on speed dial. We've identified the landowners and their attorneys, if they have one, the Department of Human Settlements, Department of Development Planning officials. And then I think, you know, because we understand there's some kind of JV going on, this might not be specific to everybody, but I think the lessons learned for us were, if there's no political will, create the political will, right? when we report stuff to JMPD, we don't just, we tell our community members now, don't just say there's activity happening on this site, on the corner of this road and that road. We get onto GIS and we know now when you tell JMPD about a land invasion, we give them the ARF number, we give them the street number, we give them the coordinates, so there's no misunderstanding around which property we're talking to. When you find out who are the guys that are actually responsible for this in your area, because JMPD have a department that deals with land invasions, and there's generally one person that deals with your area or is in charge of your area, you make friends with that person, and that way, whenever you log new calls, it's not treated as a new thing. The other thing is, make sure you evidence every interaction, and the media is your friend. Use them as if if they or as a body to create accountability and transparency in terms of everything that's happening. And then I think the last thing we've learned is the city comes in and they evict if they do, but they don't take care of the before and they don't take care of the after. So what do I mean by this is the first few times it happened, some community members were taken by surprise. People were posting messages on our community groups, inciting violence, go and protect your property. So people going out with guns, with their, I don't know, baseball bats and things like that, that's not conducive, and that's not what we want. And then post this, when it happens, there's gunshots between the cops and the land invaders. It spills out into the neighboring communities, and then of course there's violent protesting that's happened, that's been in the news recently. So what we've learned is beforehand, when we know an eviction is going to happen, we then notify the CPF, we notify the new crime wardens, we tell them about it, we tell our patrollers about it, we try to manage traffic so traffic doesn't end up driving into a space while the stuff's happening. And then post it happening, we also ensure that that we have that kind of ring of protection set up by community volunteers in a responsible manner to avoid the violence. Yeah. Then I don't know if you want me to carry on, Judy, to kind of tell you, well, so that's kind of what we're doing right now, but what we plan on doing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So we've then got an intermediate kind of plan, and that is, I talked about engaging those landowners of those vulnerable properties that we've identified, and so we almost see them as a resource, and we're trying to activate them and motivate them. We've created this change.org petition, and I guess maybe a lesson learned is don't use change.org, because when we did the petition, the idea was eventually to submit it to the Gauteng provincial legislature. But that online petition with that particular organization doesn't meet the requirements to actually to get handed through to the petitions committee at the legislature. But what it did do, getting the 1,000 signatures, is it got us the phone numbers and engagement sessions with the different MECs. So we've then been able to escalate to public safety, because JMPD rolls up into public safety, to human settlements, and to development planning. We've also included our ward councillor, the city manager, the mayor, and the speaker in the petition, right? The idea is that, as you escalate up to these different departments, and if you remember from previously, we now are trying to evidence each time that we engage with them. The idea is to almost influence accountability, because you're showing them that you know what's going on, and you can evidence that you followed their processes. So we influencing accountability in that way. And then the second thing is, I've talked about multiple departments. I've heard somebody say in the chat, when does provincial get involved? When does the COJ departments get involved? What we found is when there are multiple departments, they try to pass the buck. they should be a team. They should be working with each other. It should be like a relay. And when one person does something, they need to then pass the baton on. And what we've then decided is we're part of the team now. So we're part of the relay team. We let them know, we say, okay, Human Settlements said to us they're going to court tomorrow. Once Human Settlements has gotten to court and they've done whatever they need to do, we then go back to the Department of Public Safety and we say, well, this has happened. Are you now going to mobilize your MPD and get them to move? Once they say to us they've started doing it, we then phone our local JMPD and we say, we understand that you've gotten permission to move. Can you tell us about it? So by doing that, it's showing them as a community that we are aware of how their processes work. We know that they are supposed to be doing something, and it actually helps make things work, right? So our kind of medium-term plan is to use this petition to get as much traction and sort of accountability within these departments right now to build those relationships. Our long-term strategy is to get a land invasion interdict in place and to petition or to lobby for the city of Johannesburg to create a multi-entity land invasion task team. So there's legal precedent that's already set and we want to follow it. So how this interdict should work, this land invasion interdict, it should protect all the properties in the suburbs that we represent, President Park, Austin-View, and Glen Austin Extension 3. It must be issued in favor of this body, the Southeast Midrand Suburban Alliance, against all those seeking to evade or illegally invade property in those areas. Glen Austin Residents Association has gotten something similar in place to GARA. Once we have that interdict, we will then hand it over to our local JMPD. And what will happen when we've got this in place is that the next time there's an invasion, we don't have to go to court again. We don't have to find out who the owner of that property is and wait for them to kind of, mobilize themselves and get to a point where they can get to court. Once we have that in place, we can actually call in the next time around and say, okay, fine, there's a land invasion. We're seeing activity right now. Can somebody please come out and do it? We also want then our petitions and our engagements with the different MECs and COJ leadership to result in this multi-entity task team. There's again precedent for that because in the Western Cape, you don't have to deal with multiple departments and pull them together. You actually call the land invasion department and they then deal with it. So we want something like that over here so that we don't have to coordinate between the different departments. And that, of course, is our long-term strategy. And that's how we're trying to deal with this issue.
Thank you, Reshma. Those are the really good, practical examples of things that a community has done and some real grassroots community activism there. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. Again, thank you very much for the comments, everyone. We've got our great CAN behind the scenes team that are collating those for us, and we'll get to them in a minute. But first, I'd like to bring Judith Answer in here, who's the chair of the Greenside Residents Association. Could you give us a little bit of background on the SOS group and the occupation you're dealing with at the Parkhurst Bowls Club?
Absolutely. I'm going to show my PowerPoint to focus myself. I was aware that we have, can everyone see what I'm showing?
Yes, thank you, Judith.
Okay. So our issue, of course, is a much smaller one when I listen to Reshma for now. And I think that a lot of what I'm going to say will echo actually what everyone else has said. But our particular issue is with a public land occupation on a piece of property that we know the owner of. It's owned by the City of Johannesburg and the Johannesburg Property Company. And it actually was a bowls and soccer club for much of its existence until about 2009, when for some, the kind of lease agreement for that ended and it fell into disuse. And what we see, you can see the graphic, is a place that has become increasingly occupied and increasingly polluted and littered. So what I'm showing you on the screen now is a piece of a map that shows the urban that are involved. The red part is actually where there's an existing clubhouse on the property, and the green is an adjacent earth that goes down to the Spruit, which is why we talked about the Spruit needing to be saved. As you can see, the property is bounded on the one side by a large office park, and on the other side, we have the Quinn Street area, which is part of Parkhurst, and across the road is Pirates Club and the suburb of Greenside. And further down from the open area, the land is zoned public open space, is actually Victory Park. So what we found is that from 2009, there was an escalation until 2017 of a small but illegal occupation of this property. But since 2017, it's exploded. There's a growing social, health, crime, and human rights crisis. Julia asked me to talk about the wastepreneurs issue because it's been in the media recently, and I will address that later. That's across the road from the bowling club. It's also on Johannesburg Property Company land that is being leased by Pirates Club, and they established a waste reclamation site on that piece of land. Well, I'll talk about it a bit later. But between the waste pickers, the wastepreneurs, and the increase in the illegal occupation of this bowling club, that what we found was a really negative impact on the suburb, on residents, businesses, and terrible, terrible living conditions for the people living on the property. And our issue is primarily that our officials, our elected officials, our city officials, province officials, national officials, our state has absolutely failed everybody in this situation. They have failed the occupiers, Kelly spoke about that, but they have failed the residents and business owners and ratepayers and the people who have to walk past the site, the people who drive past the site. And so our issue is with the city and further on the province and the state, because that's who we feel has created and allowed this problem to become as huge as it has. We are very aware that homelessness, poverty are not only local problems. It is a global phenomenon that was just really highlighted by COVID. Internationally, homelessness is huge. Of course, in South Africa, we face structural issues around poverty, apartheid spatial planning that meant that people live very far from work opportunities. So people do come into public spaces to try and live near their jobs. There's a lack of public transport. There's unemployment. Those are huge structural issues that we in the Greenside Residents Association are really not going to be able to tackle on our own. But of course, we have to think about who is running the city and the province. And what about their political will? We know that the Johannesburg Property Company particularly has been bedeviled by, I don't think even just accusation and evidence of corruption, of really poor management, but that's endemic in the city. And the coalition government has, I think, in our opinion, for our suburb, has been a disaster, has undermined any possible moves forward because of a lack of, there's been no building of capacity in the city to deal with this. The city claim they have a lack of money. I believe that they only have 5 days operating budget, but we know that they've just appointed and given a lot of money for bodyguards for city officials. So it's about allocation of money. We're very aware as a residents association that there are important legal and human rights constraints to what we do, and we have never encouraged any vigilante or illegal activity. We want to work within the law. We want to make the law work for everybody. But residents associations are volunteer run. We are small. We feel isolated, we feel beleaguered, we don't get enough people paying our subs so that we can even build capacity, because people say, why should we pay you? We pay our rates, which is true, they pay their rates. So we are really constrained in terms of what we can do, but we were faced with this issue. I'm not going to go through the history. I'll keep the slides, will be available if anyone wants to watch them. And thanks to Councillor Tim Trulak from Ward 117, which is actually where the property is located. The property is located in Parkhurst, but it's obviously right across the road from Greenside. And he developed this timeline. We've got it available if anyone wants any more detail. But what we found was there was a very slow growth in the illegal occupation, that it actually really only started as waste picking in the area became a more viable occupation. And that was when a private organization called Wastepreneurs, it is an organization, a media organization called AdReach. They do all the advertising, polls and outdoor advertising. I'll say another form of pollution that they do is all those polls that they advertise on. They, as some kind of social, and it's not clear what their underlying motivations were. They claim it's all the best intentions, but they established, without legal going through processes, a waste reclamation site. And what happened was we started seeing people, some who were obviously getting some money from the Wastepreneurs site, started living in the clubhouse and then moving into the open spaces around the clubhouse and now down into the Spruit. There have been 4 tender processes between 2013, I think, actually, and 2023. Sorry, there's an error, 2013. They all failed. And actually nothing was happening. And with COVID, we knew that the numbers of homelessness in greenbelts and in the suburbs was rocketing. And actually in 2021, Johannesburg Property Company decided they would remove people illegally living in the property. At the time, they said they got an eviction order, and that stalled when lawyers got involved. And there was an interdict against the eviction. The interdict was only against a small number of people, that a small number couldn't be evicted, but the city was asked to provide a report on temporary emergency accommodation and to audit the site to see how many people are actually living there. I will say what was very frustrating is that the people living there claimed that they were working for Wastepreneurs, which is why they couldn't be moved. That turned out not to be true, but nothing happened. So we waited. As Reshma said, we wait for the city to do things. They didn't do anything. And we couldn't wait anymore for them to do the audit, for them to do what they were supposed to do. And in May 2023, the Parkhurst Residents Association had actually, with a pro bono lawyer, offered and actually took the city to court to ask to compel them to actually do the audit of the property and to give a report on the availability of temporary emergency accommodation. And you know what? We're not naive. This was dragging on, and we formed a coalition at that point because our residents and our business owners were getting increasingly distressed and angry. At around that time, in September last year, the Johannesburg Property Company issued yet another, the 5th tender bid. And at that point, they kept saying that the person who wins the bid will have to rehome temporarily at what they claim to be 80 people living on the property. There are many more at this time, because then a rumor went round that if you go to the property, you'll get houses. We've seen more and more shacks, people living in these dire conditions. There's no ablution facilities. What we see is sale of alcohol from the property, sale of drugs. There have been deaths, murders, violence, stabbing. Stolen property has been found on the property. There's a terrible problem with the burning of waste materials that can't be sold, and terrible toxic smoke all over the suburb, pollution, public defecation all around the area, and a huge amount of crime that was happening. And as I said, there was a real need to do something. So we got together. So Greenside, Parkhurst, together with Emerentia and the Parkview Community Policing Forum, and really thanks to those people who have been involved, really got together to try and do something to help our residents feel heard and help us get something, because working in silos, working in isolation really allows the city to get away with lots. We luckily were endorsed by the Melville, Craig Park, Parkview, Parktown North Residents Association, and our ward councillors. We are very lucky in both Ward 117 and Greenside Ward 87 with our ward councillors and their engagement. And just a shout out also to the Joburg CAN, and even bigger than that, the Joburg Coalition of Residents Association, which is an informal group that have started sharing information, because knowledge is power and working alone is not going to cut it. So just to say that in late March this year, preferred bidder actually finally got announced. And we think there has been some pressure on the city. And I'll tell you what we did. That what we did was exactly like Reshma. For the last decade, we have been engaging, reporting problems, questioning the city, emailing, asking for meetings. And what we found is organizations in our region, Region B, our environmental health practitioners, are incredibly helpful, but they have such limited scope. So when we phone them to say there's toxic smoke, there's terrible pollution in the Spruit, there's just plastic everywhere in the river, in the waterways, they try to help, but they have very limited scope. JMPD, as Reshma said, are unpredictable, whether you can get through, whether they actually arrive to do anything. But what we've been encouraging is to keep records. It's the most frustrating thing to tell your residents and for us ourselves to phone JMPD, to report again to environmental health, to contact Parkview SAPS, the police, and ask to insist we want a reference number for this call. Because we know actually probably nobody will go on site. Nothing will happen. But what we decided is we need to have a dossier. We need to have evidence. And we've been keeping emails, reference numbers, all requests for assistance, all photographs, video evidence, any claims that we make, any problems, we need to be able to back it up. The Parkview CPF arranged a public meeting in 2022 and their legal process is underway. But what we decided is that we needed to build community engagement and awareness. And what Reshma spoke about, one of the benefits of running a petition is you do get contact details. So what we did was in November last year, just for 2 weeks, we ran, or 2 to 3 weeks, we ran a petition process. We used a Google form so we could get all the information that the city wants. And we've got all the processes, and we got just under 3,000 separate individual signatories, but also comments. And we addressed this petition to the executive mayor and the city manager. The city manager is called Floyd Brink. And if someone had addressed the arrest warrant that was issued on him today for contempt of court to Floyd Brink and not Floyd Blink, he would have been in jail tonight. But we asked the city manager and the executive mayor to take action against and decisively address the issues, both the occupation, the environmental destruction, and the social crisis, because there's a humanitarian crisis for everybody, an environmental health and safety crisis, and a social crisis. We're not naive. We didn't think the petition was magic, that, the city are going to say, oh, the middle-class suburb of Greenside and Parkhurst are worried, and we're going to, the city know that actually our suburbs are not even their constituency in terms of a voting bloc. But we knew that we needed to consolidate protest, draw attention, and tick all the boxes. We needed to do everything the city tells us we have to do before we can take legal action, etc. We did the petition. What we wanted was to ask the city to do its job. That's all we asked. We didn't ask for red ants. We didn't ask for helicopters to come and spray toxic fumes on people. We asked the city to clean, maintain, and secure the site. And I'll tell you what was alarming is after the petition went in, for the first time, the Johannesburg Property Company agreed to a meeting with our RAs, with our organizations. And at an online meeting that I sat in, the Johannesburg Property Company said, we are not responsible for securing, maintaining, or cleaning our own site. And what was alarming is to hear their colleagues in the CRUM and in the ISD, the Integrated Service Delivery, Environmental Health, etc., saying, no, but you're the landowner, JPC. You protect the property on behalf of the city. They don't even know their own laws. I mean, that is what is absolutely frustrating. Just to say, I'm not going to go through this. This is yet another picture of the site. That what we asked is people to give their personal and concerns and experiences around the site, which were huge. Fire and health risks, children living on the site, illegal activities, and negative impacts on lots. But you know what I want to point out? Yeah, sorry, Julie?
Judith, if we can just wrap up quickly, I want to try and get to as many of these questions as possible. We're running quite tight on time. So if people wouldn't mind just staying a couple of minutes over so that we can get to some of the important things you guys have put in the chat. Go ahead, Judith.
So just to say that the one allegation that's made, and it was made when Wastepreneurs was closed down, is that we are NIMBYs. We are not in my backyard people. And if nothing, I mean, of course, nobody wants environmental degradation and poverty and crime in your backyard. But our issue is that, and lots of people in their response to the petition said, we worry about what happens to the people living in these properties, but we want to work together. We want the city to do what it needs to do. We felt we needed to tell our community. We had online meetings. We said there are no guarantees. We're very cynical and very suspicious. There are no magic solutions. And since our petition submission, suddenly, literally within 2 weeks, there was meetings, there was media. I think actually after it went to the media, News 24, we got a whole lot of contact from the city of Johannesburg, JPC. They came to site visits. They've suddenly started talking. They awarded the tender. That in itself is controversial. And as residents associations, we are cynical and we have a skeptical eye on why is there tender, who's been awarded it, and what are their motivations. There's going to be a long process. They're going to have to rezone. They're going to have to do environmental impact assessments. And the city have just dumped the responsibility for the illegal occupiers onto the new developer. I don't know what's going to happen, but they've at the same time, they have put out a request for tenders to clean the site. And that's what we've asked. And what we've committed to as a community is to support the city in maintaining, cleaning, and securing the site. It's a sort of hurry up and wait situation. Just to say about wastepreneurs, that's a different issue. They didn't have any of the licenses, environmental laws. They try to blame the residents associations for them closing down, but it actually was the city and SAPS. They just didn't follow due process. But what is interesting is that since they've closed down, we have seen a decrease in the amount of opportunistic crime. It's not perfect, but we can see the direct impact. And this is what we ended our public meeting. We had a very large public meeting, is we said we have to keep up the pressure on the city. Just because they say they've awarded a tender and everything's going to be fantastic, it feels like electioneering to us. We're cynical. We keep reminding people, we're keeping records. We ask people to support the residents associations and the CPF. And we reminded people that actually, if we don't do it, you know, it's like, if not us, who? And if not now, when? And that's my
Thanks
comments.
so much, Judith. As I said, thank you so much. And for those presentations, all of this information will be made available on our website, can.org.za. There's a little resources page, and a lot of the information that we share in these webinars is available on that platform. I'm quickly just going to try and go through as many of these questions as possible. I'll ask 5 at a time. So if anyone can still stay on, we'd really appreciate that, so you can hear some of the responses to the questions and the engagement you had in the chat. So we start with Jill, who says, do we have sufficient safe places for homeless people in the city? So we've mentioned temporary emergency accommodation, but what is the kind of policy around creating things like shelters? I'm told, there's another one here from Ahmed, I'm told COJ no longer evict, but evacuate. So what kind of different mechanisms are they using now to kind of skirt the law themselves as the city, and try and use fancy language to get away with some of the tactics that they're using? And then there's a couple of comments along this line, and I'd like to be very careful about them. And really the question is, do the rights of occupiers change depending on their nationality? So is there a different set of laws for, say, illegal immigrants? And we also need to keep in mind that, of course, a lot of these people being vulnerable means that they don't necessarily have access to home affairs. They're unregistered. So just because they don't have documents and birth certificates and all of that to prove their nationality doesn't necessarily mean that it's a purely illegal immigrant issue. But are there different laws that relate to South African citizens and temporary emergency accommodation and evictions than to foreign nationals? And then what role does provincial and national government play in both invasions and evictions? Or is it all on the head of the LA? I'm not entirely sure what that acronym means, but yeah, what are the different role players when it comes to evictions? A lot of those are for Kelly, but if any of our other panelists would like to comment.
I'll just, if Judith, Shima, do you want to comment on any of those questions?
No.
Okay. So the first question, if you can just, I was trying to scribble everything down. What was can you give me the keywords on the first one? And
safe places. So what do we do?
No, we don't. We do not have enough shelters. And this is largely because the city has cut its funding. Not just the city, sorry, I really don't want to demonize them in exclusivity. We can demonize a whole bunch of institutions here. But the Department of Social Development, where they're on a LA's local authority, where they're on a local authority level, or whether provincial or even district, there has been mass shedding of funding. So if we talk about the fire that took place in Marshalltown, where 76 people died, that was a city-owned property, again, one they don't feel responsible for maintaining. So that was also an occupation of public space. It had been hijacked, and incredibly vulnerable people who had very little means were renting from a hijacker. But before that, the property had been leased to a women's and children's shelter. I mean, that building has a sordid history, because that's during apartheid. That was also the building where everybody got their dorm passes renewed. You know, it's gone through kind of a metamorphosis and gone back to a place of doom at the end. But there aren't enough places. Money that has been budgeted in the past and had been allocated to helping people is going away. And we're not going to get rid of homelessness as a society, as a city, by hoping and not funding programs to help people get back on their feet. So no, we don't have enough spaces, and the political will to create a holistic solution that would solve questions of invasions, that would solve questions of crime, that would solve questions of taking advantage of the vulnerable, could be answered if there was a holistic approach. In 2023, at the National Homelessness Network conference, the MEC spoke about causes of homelessness and how they had created a couple of drug rehab facilities and a drug hotline. And in their opinion, drug use causes homelessness, so they've solved the problem. So that, you know, having it doesn't require a lot of intellect to have a nuanced understanding of homelessness, and the multifaceted nature of being underhoused and homeless, and that they are different. But no, our city takes a rough-handed approach, calls everybody that's homeless or everybody that's occupying spaces an illegal, as though that strips them of all their human rights, and then blames illegal people as though people can be illegal, for the maladies. And a lot of the maladies are maladministration. So no, we don't have enough spaces. We don't have enough shelters. There isn't planning for shelters. And in that we could go, there's a lot of litigation history that talks to that leads us to where we are, but there isn't planning for this. And I don't think that the politicians that are in charge think that they'll attract votes by saying we're going to be kind to the homeless in order to eradicate homelessness. And we're going to work with communities, and we're going to secure our own properties, which doesn't seem like a difficult thing to do if private property owners are expected to do the same. I think I might have answered a few of the questions in one there.
Yeah, 100%. So in terms of existing informal settlements, which modes of mobilization have fundamentally changed the way state responds by fulfilling its obligations to informal settlement dwellers? So when it comes to informal settlements, what are we doing about actually getting those on the grid, getting them formalized, you know, rather than creating the expectation that an informal settlement can happen anywhere, by designating like actual development zones?
So very little. And the place where the Freedom Charter was drafted and signed, which is Kliptown, is still without electricity. So very little is being done from a strategic, systematic approach. I think what you get, and Judith and Reshma, you can speak to, when you get a little bit of news interest, you get a little bit of interest from the state. And that's what leads to escalations and protests, because there isn't political expediency, or there isn't systematic structure, there's political expediency. So when somebody has a very loud protest, they get attention. When somebody has a very soft protest or goes through the channels that exist, they get no response. I have communities who have written, and I'm talking about 400-ish families, who have written and signed to their local ward councillor to say, we have nowhere to go and we know that we're occupying unlawfully. We really would like to not live on the foothill of a mine dump. Please help us. And they don't get a response, except for the JMPD coming and demolishing their shacks. So, and that's not newsworthy. But if somebody, if a road is filled with burning tires, it's newsworthy, and then an MEC or somebody pitches up. And so we're not seeing systematic, proper implementation of a plan to fix what could be, with proper town planning, probably a long-term, but not complex problem.
So that
when I was
also
talking about
brings up the
Lanesha
question.
South-
Sorry, Reshma, go ahead.
When I was talking about Lanesha South, what happened there was a squatter camp, that illegal settlements, because of the violent protesting that happened over the last decade and the kind of media attention it got. No one knew about that little township until this happened. A lot of that ward's funding went towards creating infrastructure and establishing, a township where a squatter camp was. So streetlights, for example, and roads, but they weren't able to fix the electricity and the water as yet. So the protesting is what created the political will. That is then what channeled the funds in the IDP for that ward to actually looking after just those communities. And I mean, over the last 10 years, 4 squatter camps in the area are now actually proper kind of established house townships. Yeah.
So this is kind of a twofold question here. So when it comes to these spaces that are occupied, is there a provision that says that people in that space have to be relocated within a certain geographical area? We've seen, some of the victims of that fire, some of the people who survived, the kind of conditions that they've been moved to on the outskirts of town, these really quite shocking mud shack, like cities. And it's, kind of heartbreaking to see the conditions they're now living in, from going from the inner city with access to work and childcare and all sorts of other auxiliary services. They're now, pushed out to the outskirts. So what is there any limitation as to, where the city can put them and how, their responsibility is to the type of housing that they get?
So the prevailing policies, which have been informed by constitutional court judgments, is that people must be kept at least in the district, or the region rather. So we all know that you've got region B or region F or what have you of Johannesburg. You need to be kept in at least that region. And the reason for that is generally your right to access to opportunities, right to development, right to the city. And oftentimes, because there are invariably children involved, it'll be their access to education that'll be affected if they have to change schools. So keeping close, but not, nobody's saying move across the street or bust, but reasonably close to enable somebody to continue developing their own opportunities. It doesn't really help you if the only person you know is your cousin who you live with, and then you suddenly get moved from Johannesburg to Ekurhuleni with no access to anything. So the plan was, after Blue Moonlight Properties judgment came out in the early noughts, was for the city to create systems where people could access emergency alternative accommodation that would also include upskilling. And over time, they would be able to afford subsidized housing. That's all good and well unless you're evicting a 86-year-old woman and her granddaughter. and her infant granddaughter. She's probably not going to be able to upskill, and she needs to be home to take care of the infant. So a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. The city was challenged in terms of Mrs. Ladler, who's the example I just mentioned, and their response was, instead of planning better, to put their hands up in the air and say, okay, well, these meddlesome NGOs have stuck their nose in it, and we're not going to do anything. And they haven't developed further the emergency accommodation, which is in the form of hostels. They haven't developed further shelters. They haven't planned for this. But homelessness in the inner city of Johannesburg and in our parks is endemic. And, much like everybody else in society, we've got good people and bad people in the homeless communities. So homeless people are victims of crime. Homeless people are also perpetrators of crime to a lesser extent than they are victims. But it's some human dignity and an acknowledgement that people have just a base level of being treated like people as opposed to cattle is sort of the prevailing thoughts on how to interpret the National Housing Code.
So you mentioned how these people are really, they're vulnerable in a lot of ways. And Reshma, you also spoke a little bit about like the organization of some of these occupations. So one of the questions is it true that some land invasions are politically motivated? And is it true that land is bought and sold in illegal settlements? And, a lot of these people are actually de facto renters from larger bodies and structures.
So from my experience in Lenasia South, property was sold by, and I think there was a carte blanche expose there. The property was sold by government officials. There are people inside of government that actually say, okay, these are JPC owned properties, these are state owned properties, these are provincial properties. And then people are told that they can actually go and access that property. They are told that, I think just like how we go, there's a particular community, we've got potholes, we want to fix it ourselves. At that point in time, the city's got these properties, the land's available, but they don't have the funds to build houses for you. So go and build it yourself. In Lenasia, the reason why that case was lost is because money was exchanged. Whoever the person was, that I think it was 3 million they got out of that corruption ring. It was a city official that represented the city. It was state-owned land. And I think people had paid hard-earned money. I guess if you were a maid, if you were a gardener, if all you were able to save up was 15,000 Rand and that's what you paid for your land package, people were willing to die for that. And in that case, it was planned. In President Park in 2021, I don't think I can mention the details, but there was actually proper intelligence that was provided. And, part of the things where I talk about trying to fill in the gaps, deal with the before, deal with the after, are kind of bringing these pieces of information to the attention of JMPD, to the attention of the SAPS via our CPF structures, because there are people that are in government that are actually saying, if you look at this piece of property, it's owned by a deceased estate or it's owned by government, and you are more likely to get, to get a positive result if you invade there. And then I think I also said that we needed to create political will, because what we found was that there was, there's an MEC of public safety. That's an EFF MEC, with, a lot of the invaders, we're told, are asked to invade by EFF. Yet we've got a MEC of development planning that's an ANC MEC, and a lot of the kind of what's the word, information that goes out into the media is, she's not doing her job, or the ANC is not doing their job, and they're not developing houses fast enough. So you could see that they were unwilling to work between departments because of this politicalness. And we had to try to understand the process, take out the politics and say, but if this department's done that, now this department has to do this next. So there's definitely, there's organization in it. There's evidence of money being exchanged to be able to afford and get human rights lawyers to represent people beforehand. But yeah, I think getting the city to kind of get the right kind of information around that and getting law enforcement to act on it, that is something else. So we've resorted to trying to get investigative journalists, to almost try and get the right kind of information so that a case can be built and so that we can actually identify who the perpetrators are. And again, at the end of the day, everybody loses out. And I think there was a comment here that says initially, whoever occupies the land says, I'm doing this myself, I don't need the city. But you are going to need supplies to water, to electricity. You're going to need someone to remove sewage and waste. So eventually you are going to need the city. And it's not an ideal situation for anybody to live in. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Reshma, and for everyone. I think we're going to draw it to a close now, but this conversation will, of course, continue on our forum, which is on the can.org website. You can register and ask other associations and groups questions around this issue and other webinars that we're doing. I think it's also really important to point out that, as we've mentioned here, there's no one size fits all. There's no silver bullet to solve this. This is not a uniquely Joburg issue. It's not a uniquely South Africa issue. It's a global issue. And we're also looking at some of the initiatives and stuff that have taken place in other parts of the world, and we'll provide the background of some of that information. Of course, the Alberts Farm Conservancy case was a landmark judgment and gives us a guide on how to hold the city accountable to the Constitution and the laws of the country when it comes to occupation and public land. But it's really the tireless efforts of communities, organizations, residents associations, CPFs, all the people we've heard about in this space tonight. And it's really important to be part of those spaces. Join your local residents association, have your say. If you think, in a lot of these cases, like Judah said, where they're treated like NIMBYs who don't want this kind of thing, be the other voice in the room if you feel that that's the case. Participate, track these issues. And I think it's really important that we really put at the forefront citizen action. So we've just had the review of some of the IDP policies and the budgets of the city, and really getting involved as communities in those actions to hold the city accountable. We've also got a fantastic webinar coming up next month, and that is on how to hold municipal directors and people in the executive to account. This has been done by ATA against certain directors of state-owned entities such as SAA, and seeing how this kind of methodology to hold people to account can be put into the municipal space. Is really important. And I think what we're hearing a lot from the people on the ground and the grassroots organizations and the legal teams that are helping them is that it's really about how do we collectively hold the city accountable for the way that it's spending its rates and taxes, and making sure that we come up with solutions. Well, not really solutions, because we're not going to solve this issue in a very holistic way, but coming up with things that are networked, things that are collaborative, things that are compassionate, and crowdsourced, that bring in both private sector, residents, occupiers, and everyone into the conversation. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you so much to our panelists. We really appreciate it. To join the CAN network or find out more, as we said, please go to our website. This has been the third episode of the CAN co-governance series. Please let us know what types of topics and if these kind of things are useful to you and your communities, so that we can grow and engage with all of your burning questions. From me, Julia Fish, and the rest of the CAN team, thank you and good night.